Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Enhancing Engagement and Performance by Leading Inclusively, part of the 2020 Alumni Webinar Series. Before we get started, I want to turn things over briefly to Shannon Tim from the Wisconsin School of Business. Shannon?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Tim, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. There's obviously a lot going on right now in our world, which has put even more emphasis on really important conversations about engagement, diversity, and inclusion. So I am really happy that my colleague at the Wisconsin School of Business, Benu Palta-Hill, is here with us today to talk about this really important topic for leaders. Before we get started, I did want to also just briefly share what else is coming up in terms of engagement opportunities for alumni. If we could go to the next slide. Perfect. We have 3 upcoming webinars scheduled on some great topics. So we have one coming up in July about empowering entrepreneurship, one in August about your personal brand, and then another one in November about delegation strategies. We have been continuing to add new webinars, so make sure to watch your email for new topics in addition to these. And then I also wanted to call your attention to a new event series called Badger Executive Talks that we're launching. These are live events that are going to be broadcast through our YouTube channel, where Dean Samba Murthy is going to be interviewing a featured executive from our alumni community about their lessons in leadership. And there's also going to be an opportunity for a live Q&A for participants to ask questions of the featured executives. So the first in this series is going to be on June 16th at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we'll be featuring John Pearson, who is an alumnus of the Wisconsin School of Business from our BBA program, and he is also Chief Executive Officer of Deloitte Risk and Financial Advisory. So we're super excited about this series and look forward to you joining us for those. For more information on any of these alumni opportunities, you can visit wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to John to get us started.
Thank you, Shannon. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. We partner with individuals and organizations to enhance performance and productivity through professional development programs, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. Professional development programs are delivered on-site at the Fluno Center in beautiful downtown Madison, and we are now offering online programs, all facilitated by instructors with practical, real-world experience. The Center for Professional and Executive Development also partners with organizations throughout the country to provide customized on-site and online professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. If you have questions you'd like to ask during today's webinar, you can submit those questions using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And you can expand or collapse that control panel using the orange arrow you'll see on your screen. We'll pose questions that are submitted during a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. And I also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and a copy of the presentation will be made available within the next few days. And now I'd like to introduce today's facilitator, Benu Palta-Hill, Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Wisconsin School of Business. Benu Palta-Hill has spent the last 23 years working on campus, predominantly in teaching and consulting in change management, organizational cultural dexterity, and inclusive leadership, as well as developing recruitment and retention programs to enhance diversity. A distinguishing factor in Ms. Hill's approach is a combination of academic research and lived experience to dissect core issues related to identity differences. This approach is apparent in the Diversity Lunch and Learn series she founded in 2010. In May 2015, Ms. Hill represented the Wisconsin School of Business at the White House, and she has been an invited speaker at conferences and corporations in North America and Europe. Her 100+ engagements have ranged from keynote addresses to hands-on workshops on topics such as conflict resolution, employee engagement, vulnerability and curiosity in leadership, inclusive leadership, and cultivating inclusion. Ms. Hill's work has been featured in the Cap Times and Biz Education. She's also been recognized by the university and Madison community with an Educational Innovation Award, the 2017 Outstanding Woman of Color Award, and the 2018 Wisconsin Alumni Association Leadership Award. Benu, I'm going to pass control over you now, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. And welcome everyone. I want to start with a definition of what engagement is. So employee engagement, we talk about this a lot. It is about the level of passion that one feels for their work. It's how much do we identify ourselves within the context of our work. So for example, if I feel a high connection to my organization and its goals, as well as my colleagues, likely I will have high levels of engagement. And those are apparent in the amount of effort we put into our work and how we behave. So for example, if I'm highly engaged, it's whether I need to stay after work or whether I need to spend time making sure the project is complete rather than just checking the box to do the work. That comes with the levels of engagement that we feel to our work. And research shows that employees who are highly satisfied with their work environment are highly engaged, and those who are highly dissatisfied are the least engaged. I'm curious, if you wouldn't mind typing it in, what percentage of the global workforce do you think is highly engaged?
And again, you can respond to that question by putting your response in the questions box and go to webinar. All right, Banu, I see some responses coming in, really ranging from down as low as 15% up to 80% and averaging around 50% as the average
Okay.
response, I would say.
Well, we have a very optimistic group today, so that's wonderful. Unfortunately, it's around 32%. So if we think about it, if 32% of the global workforce is fully engaged, what is everyone else doing? Why are they disengaged? And how do we quantify the loss of productivity, innovation from the majority of the employees? And what's interesting is that over 40% of the workforce is actually actively disengaged, which means that they're doing the bare minimum. They are essentially doing, kind of checking the boxes and doing what they need to do to get by. And they are likely spending a lot of time looking for other jobs or being distracted and they do not feel the level of connection to the organization nor to their colleagues. And this is important because um, employee engagement has an influence on a number of areas in an organization. Not only does it influence how well an employee performs, but retention, turnover, productivity, efficiency, how it requires engagement to make sure that you're collaborating with your colleagues and to be creative. And there's actually also a lot of empirical evidence that it influences profitability. So, and not to mention the personal loss in terms of health and overall happiness for the employee themselves. And we know from research that it is the higher engagement organizations have about 200% higher performance than their low engagement counterparts. And earnings per share growth tends to be 4 times for high engagement organizations than that of their competitors. And overall, they're 21% more profitable. And there are better health outcomes and number of other benefits for employees themselves. So how do we create a culture of engagement? We know that engagement is a direct outcome of the organizational culture. And when we think about culture, the norms in a culture are set by those in power, so by leadership. So when we look at high performing cultures, research points out that they are built on trust. They're built on role modeling from leaders who are embodying authenticity. And these are characteristics, is trust and authenticity is critical for driving change and for innovation. For example, innovation actually is a direct outcome of diversity, I mean, diverse perspectives operating in an inclusive environment. So we can have a lot of diversity, but if there's no inclusion, meaning there's not a voice for everybody at the table and their voice is not considered, then we will not have true inclusion or true innovation. So leadership really defines the cultural norms through their behavior. And we'll spend most of the time today talking about how do we practice the skills that make us a leader that can guide a positive and high performing culture. Essentially, how do we become inclusive leaders? I want to share a little bit more of research. This is from Gallup. What is the biggest accelerator that employees find in terms of their career advancement? And 38% are feeling accepted and comfortable at work. So inclusion becomes a key component in this area. Do people feel they have to cover aspects of themselves to conform to a culture? Do they feel like they can be the core parts of their identity? They don't have to hide in order to feel like they're part of the team, and also that they're not advocating constantly only for themselves, that there are people, others. This is managers, but actually there's also evidence that if colleagues advocate on your behalf, that also heightens engagement. And then what are the behaviors by leaders that are barriers, people perceive to be barriers to career growth? And so 25% leaders who prioritize office politics, we often call that managing up. So it becomes apparent to a team or to team members when leaders are prioritizing managing up than really leading the team and managing the team collectively. And then also not having a shared vision. Once you don't, if there's no shared vision, it's very difficult for people to feel a sense of belonging, to feel like they have a stake in it. So it's hard to be engaged in an environment where you don't even know how you're contributing to the larger goal. And so you have to have a sense of accomplishment and a sense of that you're making a difference. We all have, that's an innate need human beings have. And if there's no clear vision, we can't even begin to piece that together. And then not understanding employees' strengths. This is about, that are we kind of looking at our teams and our team members just as a number, as somebody who can do, it's much more, again, the check the box and sort of a compliance oriented perspective rather than really individually understanding what people are passionate about and what drives them. So really looking at it from a growth perspective. And then finally, what are the actions most important for employees to observe in a leader? It's giving credit where it's due. This is really, really critical. Actually, we may even have the numbers. I'm gonna double check the numbers. I think the giving credit when it's due is higher than 25%. And then listening actively. When we tend to, when we engage with people, either I know I do this all the time, that, we tend to listen to respond. So we listen enough, and then we are formulating already subconsciously how we're going to respond to it. But actually, if we pause and listen actively, we seek to understand rather than to respond. And there's a big difference. And there's actually evidence that even our body language shifts, and people see that, and our tone shifts when we are listening actively versus when we're listening to respond. And then taking accountability for things when they go wrong. That is a core component. Leaders who tend to either take credit when things are going well and then step aside when things are not going well don't tend to have the kind of influence to be able to make a difference, to be able to really lead effectively. And then starting projects with a purpose. Again, that shared goal is really, really important. So what are the traits that we're looking for that we want to develop in ourselves, in leaders, essentially and when we talk about leaders, we're not just talking about as somebody in the C-suite. We're talking about every single one of us within our sphere of influence, and how we make a difference in that sense. So I'm going to go through each of these and explain what they mean, and then what are the behaviors that we can practice that are associated with each of these. So first is commitment, because there has to be a genuine commitment, because staying the course is hard. So one can believe in the fact that, yes, I believe in the business case for diversity. We know that diverse teams performing in inclusive environments far outperform their homogeneous counterparts. So you can believe in it from that perspective, but there has to be a commitment from the heart. So it's really a connection of the mind and heart, in that not only are we allocating resources and ensuring that everyone has an understanding of what is the value of diversity and inclusion in an organization, but also that our behavior reflects it internally, that we treat everyone with fairness and respect. Inclusive leaders ensure a sense of belonging for each person. And that sense of belonging is really critical, because it's controlled by the same part of the brain as our need for food and water. So when we don't feel like we belong, it can feel very devastating, almost like a matter of life and death. I mean, think about a time when you felt like you were going through struggles at work and you didn't feel a sense of belonging, and when you confide in your friends or colleagues, and if they tell you, well, it's not as bad as you think, it's not as bad as you think, or you're overreacting. The issue, though, is we know from neuroscience, for the person experiencing that lack of belonging, they genuinely, those are the chemical reactions, physiological reactions happening in their body, where they do genuinely feel like it's a matter of life and death, because of the physiological chemical reactions occurring in the body. So an inclusive leader has to appreciate and understand and ensure a sense of belonging for each person. And then they have to understand individual identities and values. That, it's not just that, oh yeah, I have the finance person, I have the HR person. It's really about understanding individuals and what are the most important parts of their identity. So for example, if a leader doesn't even know in a group, if one of their team members has a special needs child, or that they're taking care of elderly parents, that's critical information to understand the lived experience of that individual. So if there isn't enough time taken to understand those identities and values, then the rest goes by the wayside. So we are not able to establish that sense of belonging, and we're not able to connect. So that connection of the heart and mind in commitment has to be true. It has to be authentic. So from a business perspective, in terms of allocating the appropriate resources, so it can't just be talk, and it has to be exhibited in behavior, personal behavior. And then secondly, there's courage. And courage has two aspects to it. One is humility, which is that we have an awareness of our personal strengths as well as our blind spots, that we know that that just because you're in a leadership position doesn't mean you are an expert in all areas, or that it's especially now more than ever, we live in a very specialized corporate environment, and so no one person has the expertise in everything. So this is critical for a leader to understand, that to have some humility. And then the second aspect of the courage is bravery. And that means that they can be an agent for change. So some of the behaviors that we associate with humility would be admitting mistakes, acknowledging personal limitations, and actively seeking feedback. And for behavior, that challenging these entrenched organizational attitudes and practices that promote exclusion or homogeneity, holding others accountable for non-inclusive behaviors. There's a great example that I always like to use is from the McKinsey company. They found, this is a couple, I think maybe 15 years ago or so, they found that they had consultants who tended to solve problems in a very similar fashion. They didn't have much cognitive diversity. And when they examined where they were hiring their talent from, it tended to be from the same Ivy League universities that the senior partners had gone to. So essentially, it was like a legacy hiring. And what their HR did is they took off the name of the institution and then gave the review the candidates' resumes for review, and they were able to quickly diversify. So whoever challenged that entrenched attitude, I mean, that takes a level of bravery to say, why are we only hiring from these institutions, even though knowing that the senior partners went there. So it's about challenging status quo and being able to be that change agent and to leverage your own personal power and professional power. So for example, personal power would be the credibility, the power given to us by our colleagues, by our subordinates, superiors. It's our political capital. So the more credibility we have, the more personal capital we gain. And then there's the formal power, formal capital, which is given to us by our position in the organization. So it has more to do with the organizational chart. So when you think about change, it can actually occur, the catalyst can be anyone. Because if you think about it, there are people in organizations, they may not have the most formal power, but it seems to be that people go and talk to them and nothing really gets done unless they're on board. It means that they have established enough credibility to be able to make change. So they're both kinds. So don't feel limited if you feel like, oh, well, in the org chart, I'm not at the level that I would like to be in order to call out changes. Okay, so 3, the cognizance of bias. Well, cognizance of bias is important because that's a leader's Achilles heel. Cognizance has to do with 2 aspects. There's a self-regulation, so acceptance of bias and understanding of its impact on others. So it's about understanding that it doesn't matter what I think my intent was. That doesn't matter as much as what was the impact of my actions on others. So having that understanding that my intent is not always equal the impact that somebody else experiences. The second aspect of cognizance of bias is the fairness. So it's awareness of bias in its outcomes, processes, and communication. So it's the ability to have empathy, and that are we able to share the processes applied and reasons for decision making. So that sense of community and collaboration. So let me go back to the self-regulation and talk about some of the behaviors that are associated with it. So it's about learning about personal biases, and we can do that. There are a number of ways. One of the ones that's most widely used is the implicit association test. It's on the Harvard website. So iat.harvard.edu, and you can takes about 10 minutes, and you can take it for a variety of different characteristics for gender, religion, color, ethnicity, and it tells you a little bit about what are your leanings, what are your tendencies, where the biases may show up. And there are other more elaborate methods, or that are take slightly longer. There's something called the intercultural development inventory. It's a quantitative measure of how each of us engages with difference. That do we have a tendency to ignore the difference, so practice blindness, or do we sort of become polarized, where we think that one has to be good, one has to be bad, or are we able to adapt and our behavior and shift our mindset? So it's a whole continuum. So there are a lot of different resources you can use in terms of assessment. But something very off the cuff that I tend to use for myself is pay attention to what surprises you about people. As soon as you begin to pay attention to what surprises you, we tend to become aware. We can think about, why did that surprise me? Why did I not expect that of that person? Because remember, our expectations of people and our perceptions of them are guided by our biases. So we expect successful people to look like this, or to do this, engage in these behaviors, or we expect intelligent people to do this. So you can put in any one characteristic, and it tells us a little bit about what our limitations are. And so the second part, the fairness piece of the cognizance of bias, it has to do with really being committed to making merit-based fair decisions, and that you use transparency, consistency, and informed decision making, where you share clear explanations of what process you applied and why you made the decisions that you made. Oftentimes, I think we, partially because of time constraints, partially because of depending on the nature of hierarchies in organizations, we think, well, that's what the leader decided, and that's what it is. It's amazing how you can influence the culture by simply explaining your decision, that communication tactic, versus just sharing the outcome, just sharing the decision. It creates a very different level of trust, very different level of feelings of belonging and collegiality. It makes a big difference in small behaviors, in changes in small behaviors. Finally, 4, so curiosity. So this is about openness and perspective taking. So because we have our own limitations, every person has limitations based on whatever experiences we've had, and we have developed and certain biases and certain categories in our minds that we attribute to different people. And curiosity allows us to have an open mindset, or rather a growth mindset. So it's an openness to one's own limitations and valuing new ideas and experiences, that there isn't only one truth or one lens on reality. There can be multiple lenses based on how we walk through our day. So as an Indian woman who works on campus, who is petite, there are certain experiences that I have that others may not have, who are not like me. So much of my lived experience is guided by how people perceive me. And my visible characteristics, visible identity characteristics for people who don't know me, that's all they have to go on in terms of their perceptions and expectations of me. So having an openness to that, okay, I will have some limitations in trying to assess this person, is about curiosity. And the other part of it is about perspective taking. So, are we trying to enhance an understanding of different views? Are we listening? Are we engaging in respectful discourse, demonstrating the ability to be able to see things from others' perspectives? This is more important than ever. I think this curiosity piece, especially given in the current political and social environment that we're living in today. I think, a lot of times we feel very wedded to our view of reality. And as soon as it becomes personalized, because we tend to, it's easier to take on a different perspective when it's someone we know or someone we like or respect. It changes the conversation. So I will tell you, I got a note from a colleague at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, who is an African American male. After last week's events, he said he wanted to share with some of his peers at other schools a letter that he sent to his colleagues, and it was titled "Thoughts from Your Black Colleague," and he talked about the impact of what the current events with the protests, with the death of George Floyd, and what it did to him, and what was his experience. And I think I couldn't stop thinking about it for days after reading that. Now, that is much more compelling. I mean, it moved me in ways that all sorts of things I've read online or in the paper, that the collective nature of all of those didn't move me in the same way as that one letter from him. And I think we have to remember that we are able to take perspective of others when we have a connection with them. So if we don't connect with people, we won't be able to take perspective. We won't be able to expand our own awareness of issues, or not withhold judgment, because the more information we have, we are less likely to hold judgment and be more open to different ideas. And in leadership, that's critical, especially to innovation and to really motivating people. And then the third part of curiosity is coping with uncertainty. It's that acceptance that some ambiguity is to be expected. As human beings, we don't like ambiguity. I mean, even when you text somebody and, the little 3 dots come on the phone, it drives us crazy if the person takes too long. We don't like uncertainty. So what happens is our brain starts to develop its own stories. We start to fill in the blanks because we needed the ambiguity to go away. And with leaders, inclusive leaders, they try to subdue that instinct. What they do is they demonstrate courage by saying that's okay. We can embrace change and see it as an opportunity, and they try to connect with diverse range of people. And so they don't limit themselves, because when we are in uncertain situations, we start to have a groupthink or tribal mentality. And inclusive leaders try to go out of that instinct, and they actually go out of their way to diversify their thinking and be okay with ambiguity. Okay, so cultural intelligence. There's two aspects. So there is the drive, which is that, you have a personal desire and you understand that there are organizational benefits to learning about different ways of life. And this isn't just global cultures. I mean, it could even be urban and rural cultures in the US or even in Wisconsin. It's basically any difference that we experience. It's that drive to try to understand that there are different ways of doing things, while withholding judgment. That doesn't mean you can't have a preference for one way of doing things over another, but it's more that we acknowledge that there are equally valid ways of doing things that other people may prefer. And it's the behavior that's associated with this is really taking an active interest in learning about, quote, the other. And so, are we seeking out opportunities to experience diverse environments? Are we confident when we lead, diverse teams? Do we actually take the opportunity to look at how we all connect and what diversity we bring to the team? This is a critical component, because it actually goes hand in hand with the idea of curiosity. And I should mention, there's another aspect that comes into play is vulnerability. So are we able to be vulnerable and model authenticity? Because remember, it's very difficult to be authentic if we are not comfortable sharing our stories and experiences and being vulnerable when appropriate, because then we can't invite others to do the same. We have to model that behavior. And cultural intelligence has a lot to do with that. And then it's also the idea of shifting our mindsets and adapting our behavior. So it's an important aspect of curiosity and learning. And embodying a lot of these characteristics and behaviors, it actually allows us to set a culture within the organization that is a growth mindset culture. So people feel like they are encouraged to take perspective. They're encouraged to take risks in understanding other perspectives. Finally, collaboration. So collaboration has to do with three things. And remember, collaboration is very different than teamwork. Teamwork is where you divide up a task or divide up a project into tasks, and everybody does their part and you have a complete project. Collaboration is about, it has to be that there's a fundamental engagement for the goal of the organization or the team or the project, whatever it is, that there's a shared purpose and shared goal. And there are three things in that a leader has to do, which is empowerment, ensuring that other people feel comfortable and are able to contribute independently, and that you're empowering them to make decisions or have a say in decisions that impact them and their work. And then teaming, that being conscientious of diversity of thinking in team composition and processes. And this can be even things like attributes like introverts, extroverts, because oftentimes extroverts tend to speak up more. And an inclusive leader would think about, okay, what about the introverts on my team? Have I gotten their voice? Perhaps they don't feel as comfortable speaking up in a meeting, and do I allow them to communicate with me in other ways that are more comfortable for them? And finally, the voice, that the process and style to ensure that every team member has a voice, and explicitly including everyone and creating an environment where people feel comfortable to speak up. So I've gone through a lot of content, and if we were doing this in person, there are some exercises I always enjoy doing with the participants. But given that we're doing this virtually, I hope that there are 4 things I want to make sure that you take away from this webinar. One is, as an inclusive leader, as you develop your skills, model authenticity. That means share your stories and experiences. Be vulnerable when you think it's appropriate. Remember, we are taught to not act vulnerable because we're taught, socialized to think that's a weakness. It actually is not. It's critical to connection, human connection. It's critical to evoking empathy. And empathy in the workplace is extremely important to teamwork. And then if you lead with that, others will feel they will do the same. They will also follow your lead. And then communicate transparently. Share your own perspective and be open and be an active listener and bring other voices to the table. It's really empowering to have somebody else want to know something about your perspective or your experience. And it's amazing just simply by asking how much connection you can evoke with another person or you can build. And then invest in relationships. Foster an environment where there are strong relationships are valued. Be an advocate and show acceptance. The relationships part is really, really critical. It's amazing as far as engagement. People who have very good relationships with their colleagues and their supervisors tend to be highly engaged because we feel valued, we feel like our work is recognized, and we feel that we have a stake in it, in the larger goal. And finally, evolve constantly. It's really about continuing to learn and grow and develop new leadership traits and constantly hold yourself accountable for building those skills and for advancing inclusion. And one of the ways that sometimes we stumble on it, people often ask, well, how do I do this? How do I kind of do it in a way that's more finessed? And I would say that whoever you're talking to, you can even say practice the vulnerability by saying, hey, I've been working on this particular skill, so bear with me while I practice it. It's quite actually that in itself, showing the vulnerability builds a connection. So with that, I want to leave 15 minutes for questions. So if I will turn it back to John.
Thank you, Banu. So if you have questions, please submit them now through the questions box. We had a couple questions come in here that I will pose to Banu, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to send them over now. So Banu, to start, can you talk a little bit about how you can start practicing vulnerability effectively?
Yeah, actually, the vulnerability, it's once you begin to think about, as soon as most of us, we have an instinct to share something with someone because that's kind of the authentic self. But because we're socialized or taught to think, oh, well, being professional, that would be unprofessional, even though it's so integral to the work we're doing, sharing that experience, we pause and we put on this armor. The armor might be perfectionism, it might be cynicism, but rather, if we actually engage, if we stop right there and engage with curiosity, and so it can be something like, John, I don't know how this is done, but can you walk me through it? Or why do you think it's important to do it the way that we're doing it? Things like that. That can be vulnerability in itself, because even though in my mind as a leader, I should have all the answers, I'm showing that, no, you tell me. And then engaging with curiosity. A lot of times, another kind of vulnerability. So one is about, lack of knowledge of something, but another type of vulnerability is a lot of times, we cover our identities. So for example, I have two children. There are a lot of obligations my husband and I have when it comes to the kids. And if I feel compelled to hide, so rather than saying, well, it's my son's last day of school, I need to bring treats to school, so I'm sorry I won't be able to join this meeting, that I feel compelled to make up an excuse where I don't want to be put into a category of, oh no, she won't want, she's not as ambitious. She has children, she's distracted. So that kind of thing. So as leaders, we have to make it okay for people to not cover, and we can do that by ourselves revealing those things about ourselves. So if I say that, then I'm showing it's okay, it's acceptable for us to have, we all have lives outside of work.
Great, thank you, Banu. Another question we had come through was with regard to advocating for your employees, which you talked a little bit about earlier. To what extent does that involve managing up? And can you talk a little bit about whether that sometimes necessitates the need to play company politics so that you can make sure the team has all the resources that they need?
Sure. I think that's where the transparency comes in. So, of course, we all work in very political environments, and the issue is that oftentimes when we are managing the politics, it's easy to get it to a point where we're constantly managing up. And I think having, even if it's an environment where we do have to manage up quite a bit, having the transparency with your team, with your employees, so that they know you're advocating on their behalf. And perhaps you can't share details about how you're managing up, but keeping that communication open, it goes a long way. So it's really about, I think where people get carried away and where you lose that sense of belonging is if the employees aren't even aware that you're doing it, because the assumption then becomes the lack of connection with the employees will lead to them assuming you're doing it for self-promotion rather than for the good of the team or good of, particular team members.
Wonderful, thank you. So
Sure.
another question we had come in was a participant looking for some advice on how they can become more aware of their own biases.
Yeah. Like I said, my favorite sort of trick is, really becoming more aware of when you're surprised by people. I think this tells us a lot about and it's nothing, we all have these biases, and it's nothing that, they are actually a fundamental part of survival, the way that they're built into us. But what we can do is start to question them. So pay attention to when you're surprised by someone. Why did you get surprised? I mean, I've experienced this across from the business school, is a homeless shelter, Porch Light. When I've gone across the street, I found there have been times where I avoid eye contact, and I I I've become more aware of it because I realize, why am I doing that? What are my perceptions about someone who might be homeless? And what are the biases I hold? What are my expectations? Do I think, and oftentimes my expectations, actually, the experience I have is contrary to my expectations. Like when I avoid eye contact, the person more often than not says hello or makes a comment about the weather. And I think becoming more in tune with what are some ingrained biases we have is quite helpful. And then you can do, more extended trainings about identity. Like, think about, all of us have aspects of identities where we have been in situations where either included or excluded. So thinking about the whole in group and out group, thinking about when we have had to cover aspects of our identity or downplay them, and what that might be doing to the environment, and how, if you see somebody else doing it, and how you can step in. So I think those are some of the ways. I mean, the surprise one is really critical. And then you can have a partner in learning. I have a colleague that I rely often on. We tell each other that, if we're operating in a way in a meeting where one of us thinks the other person is being biased, we pass each other a note, and it's kind of a check from a trusted colleague or friend. So there are ways to do that. I think the more authentic relationships you have, the more people are engaged in your own growth. And you can collectively, I mean, it can really be seen as, this is the way you develop a growth mindset as an organization and as a culture.
Great, thank you, Banu.
Mhm.
So earlier in the
Other
presentation,
questions? Oh, sorry.
yes, earlier in the presentation, you shared some figures about the percentage of employees who were engaged and disengaged. Would you mind repeating those?
Yeah. So globally, the percentage of employees who are uh, fully actively engaged are about 32%. And then it's about 40% are actively disengaged. So they're more at the kind of opposite end. And then there are others who are engaged, but not fully engaged.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And Banu, what can leaders do to start to set an inclusive tone for their team's culture?
I think the first and foremost is to have a discussion with the team. Ask, get everyone around the table and ask each individual. If you have a lot of introverts on your team, maybe ask them to write it on a post-it and put it on the board after they put it, and someone can read them. That what is most important to you to feel included, or to feel like you belong? What's a characteristic in the environment that is critical, that's non-negotiable? And then once you have that, even having that conversation, you'll see a change in people's behavior, in the words they use, in the way they relate to each other, the body language. And then ask, can we have a rule, or not even a rule, but of rules of engagement. I mean, I always do this with my supervisors. If I have a new supervisor, first thing I do is, what are our rules of engagement? Are we going to give each other honest opinions, or is that okay? That, it's like getting permission from people, that can we be partners in learning? And I would just start there, and then from there, you can always engage in other activities, learn a little bit, have socials where you learn a little bit about people, and then being mindful, having peer-to-peer recognition or top-down recognition for when people are inclusive of others. So it really highlights the value of inclusive behaviors.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
So Banu, I have three additional questions for you. The first one is pretty straightforward. Would you be able to repeat the link to the Harvard survey that you mentioned?
Yes, it's the implicit association test, and it's iat.harvard.edu. Or even if you put implicit association test in Google, you'll find it right away.
Wonderful, thank you, Banu. And I will put that in the chat box momentarily for everybody as well. The next
Okay.
question, Banu, and you touched on this a little bit in the previous response, but maybe you could dig into it a little bit more. how do you foster an inclusive environment when there are deeply held beliefs that your team members hold? For example, people with strongly conservative beliefs versus people with strongly liberal beliefs.
Yeah, that's a great question and very relevant, especially in the environment we're in. We actually, I mean, I think that's where you have to have the connection, right? There's a lot of research that shows when we have empathy toward people, we tend to be more open to perspective taking. So that doesn't mean we change our mind necessarily, but we have more empathy, and likely it changes us little bit, right? And so when you share something, so if you think about this, if there's a colleague that you really would rather not work with, and then you find out something personal, an experience they're struggling with, an illness, either they have or a family member has, some universal experience, I guarantee you, you will not be able to look at that person and think the exact same way. You may still not prefer their company, but empathy will be evoked in the brain. In fact, those chemicals, I mean, it's a physiological reaction. So I would say the more you can get your team to connect, the more, and without withholding, I mean, without kind of judging. I think that's really the key. In that case, I would also do, I think the intercultural development inventory is a great tool that I mentioned, with that it's a quantitative measure of how we approach difference. And the really amazing part about it is non-judgmental. So no matter what stage you're at, there are some strengths to being there and some weaknesses. And so you could have your team take that and then say, as a team, because it can give you results that as a team, this is where we fall overall. And then and then it gives you some ways that you can orient yourself to become more inclusive. And then it gives you your personal results as well. And so, that way you're able to have open discussions, like really going through identity exercises and looking at what parts of your identity influence your daily experience the most. I mean, I learned that, for example, I had a colleague who is a professor. He's African American from the South and is gay. And whenever we would talk, I mean, the one element that most influenced his daily experience and how people perceived him was color, above all. It wasn't his accent, his Southern drawl. It wasn't the fact that he's gay, and it was about color, and people made most assumptions about that. So being able to understand that, and once you start to connect issues with real people that you care for and that you work with or you are friends with, it becomes a different conversation. It's a lot easier for us to distance ourselves from it when it's happening elsewhere, when we think it's elsewhere. I mean, they've done studies of, of people's perceptions of wars. And so if you have seen war on your kind of around you, and been in the area in warfare, where in the country, in the town where you are, it's a very different kind of experience than if you're watching it happening elsewhere. So it's that relatability factor. And I think the same can be applied in organizations, the same research, because we have the same instincts. We relate more to people we know.
Thank you, Banu. And that actually touched on the answer to the last question I was going to ask. So I think that is all the time we have for questions today. Banu, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone else who joined us on the webinar today. Later this week, you will be receiving a link to a survey where you can provide feedback on today's webinar. And we'll also provide a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For more information about the alumni services provided by the Wisconsin School of Business, or to sign up for future alumni webinars, please visit us online at wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. So Banu, thank you again, and thank you again to everyone who joined us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.